Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Rambling Through History. My name is Jacob, and today we're going to be taking a look at what I believe to be very forgotten war crimes of the Japanese Empire during World War II. Now, this will be a two-part series as I want to make sure to cover a good amount of each of these, and today we'll be looking at two of the atrocities that the Japanese took out against the Chinese and Americans. And with that, let's go on with the video. In December of 1937, the Japanese Imperial Army marched into China's capital city of Nanking and proceeded to murder 300,000 out of 600,000 civilians and soldiers in the city. The 6 weeks of carnage would become known as the Rape of Nanking and represented the single worst atrocity during World War II era in either the European or Pacific theater of war. The actual military invasion of Nanking was preceded by a tough battle at Shanghai that began in the summer of 1937. Chinese forces there put up a surprisingly stiffer resistance against the Japanese army, which had expected an easy victory in China. The Japanese had even bragged that they would conquer all of China in just 3 months. The stubborn resistance by the Chinese troops upset that timetable. With the battle dragging on through the summer into late fall, this infuriated the Japanese and whetted their appetite for the revenge that was to follow at Nanking. After finally defeating the Chinese at Shanghai in November, 50,000 Japanese soldiers then marched on toward Nanking. Unlike the troops at Shanghai, Chinese soldiers at Nanking were poorly led and loosely organized. Although they greatly outnumbered the Japanese and had plenty of ammunition, they withered under the ferocity of the Japanese attack, then engaged in a chaotic retreat. After just 4 days of fighting, Japanese troops smashed into the city on December 13, 1937, with orders issued to kill all captives. Their first concern was to eliminate any threat from the 90,000 Chinese soldiers who surrendered. To the Japanese, surrender was an unthinkable act of cowardice and the ultimate violation of the rigid code of military honor drilled into them from childhood onward. Thus, they looked upon the Chinese POWs with utter contempt, viewing them as less than human, unworthy of life. The elimination of Chinese POWs began after they were transported by trucks to remote locations on the outskirts of Nanking. As soon as they were there assembled, the savagery began, with young Japanese soldiers encouraged by their superiors to inflict maximum pain and suffering upon individual POWs as a way of toughening themselves up for future battles, and also to eradicate any civilized notions of mercy. Film footage and still photographs taken by Japanese themselves document the brutality. Smiling soldiers can be seen conducting bayonet practice on live prisoners, decapitating them and displaying severed heads as souvenirs, and proudly standing among mutilated corpses. Some of the Chinese POWs were simply mowed down by machine gun fire, while others were tied up, soaked with gasoline, and burned alive. After the destruction of the POWs, the soldiers turned their attention to the women of Nanking, and an outright animalistic hunt ensued. Old women over the age of 70, as well as little girls under the age of 8, were dragged off to be sexually abused. More than 20,000 females, with some estimates as high as 80,000, were raped by Japanese soldiers, then stabbed to death with bayonets or shot so they could never bear witness. Pregnant women were not spared. In several instances, they were raped and then had their bellies slit open and fetuses torn out. Sometimes, after storming into a house and encountering a whole family, the Japanese forced Chinese men to rape their own daughters, sons to rape their mothers, and brothers their sisters, while the rest of the family was made to watch. Throughout the city of Nanking, random acts of murder occurred as soldiers frequently fired their rifles into panicked crowds of civilians, killing anyone. Other soldiers killed shopkeepers, looted their stores, then set the buildings on fire after locking people of all ages inside. They took pleasure in the extraordinary suffering that ensued as the people desperately tried to escape the flames by climbing onto rooftops or leaping down onto the street. Their incredible carnage, citywide burnings, stabbings, drownings, strangulations, rapes, thefts, and massive property destruction continued for about 6 weeks. From mid-December of 1937 through the beginning of February 1938, young or old, male or female, anyone could be shot on a whim by any Japanese soldier for any reason. Corpses could be seen anywhere throughout the city. The streets of Nanking were said to literally have run red with blood. Those who were not killed on the spot were taken to the outskirts of the city and forced to dig their own graves. Large rectangular pits that would be filled with decapitated corpses resulting from killing contests the Japanese held among themselves. Other times, the Japanese forced the Chinese to bury each other alive in the dirt. After this period of unprecedented violence, the Japanese eased off somewhat and settled in for the duration of the war. To pacify the population during the long occupation, highly addictive narcotics, including opium and heroin, were distributed by the Japanese soldiers to the people of Nanking, regardless of age. An estimated 50,000 people became addicted to heroin, while many others lost themselves in the city's opium dens. In addition, the notorious comfort women system was introduced, which forced young Chinese women to become slave prostitutes, existing solely for the sexual pleasure of Japanese soldiers. Within hours of their December 7th, 1941 attack on the American naval base of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese military began its assault on the Philippines, bombing airfields and bases, harbors, and shipyards. Manila, the capital of the Philippines, sits on Manila Bay, one of the best deepwater ports in the Pacific Ocean, and it was, for the Japanese, a perfect resupply point for their planned conquest of the South Pacific. After initial air attacks, 43,000 men of the Imperial Japanese 14th Army went ashore on December 22nd at 2 points on the main Philippine island of Luzon. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of all Allied forces in the Pacific, cabled Washington, D.C. that he was ready to repel this main invasion force with 130,000 troops of his own. MacArthur's claim was a fiction. In fact, his own force consisted of tens of thousands of ill-trained and ill-equipped Filipino men and some 22,000 American troops who were, in effect, of split and polished garrison soldiers with no combat experience, artillerymen, and small group of painless pilots and ground crews, and sailors whose ships happened to be in port when Japanese bombed Manila and its naval yards. At the landing beaches, the Japanese soldiers quickly overcame these defenders and pushed them back and back again until MacArthur was forced to execute a planned withdrawal to the jungle, about to the Bataan Peninsula. This thumb-like piece of land was the west coast of Luzon, across from the Bay of Manila, measured some 30 miles long and 15 miles wide, with a range of mountains down the middle. MacArthur had planned badly for the withdrawal and left tons of rice and ammunition and other stores behind him. The Battle of Bataan began on January 6, 1942, and almost immediately the defenders were on half rations, sick with malaria, fever, and other diseases, living on monkey meat and few grains of rice. Without air cover or naval support, the Allied forces of the Philippines and Americans held out for 99 days. Though they ultimately surrendered, their stubborn defense of the peninsula was a significant propaganda victory for the United States, and that proved that the Imperial Japanese Army was not the invincible force that had rolled over so many colonial possessions in the Pacific. It was against this backdrop that the Bataan Death March, a name conferred upon by the men who had endured it, began. The forced march took place over some 2 weeks after General Edward Ned King, U.S. commander of all ground troops on the Bataan, surrendered his thousands of sick, endangered, and starving troops on April 9, 1942. The Siege of Bataan was the first major land battle for the Americans in World War II, and one of the most devastating military defeats in American history. The force on the Bataan, numbering some 76,000 Filipino and American troops, is the largest army under American command ever to surrender. Japanese military leaders had severely underestimated the number of prisoners that were likely to capture and were therefore unprepared, logistically and materially, for the tens of thousands taken into captivity. As word spread of King's decision, Allied troops surrendered in groups large and small. It was at this time that the first atrocity occurred, when Japanese soldiers executed 350 to 400 Filipino officers. With prisoners of war scattered across the peninsula, the Japanese finally ordered them to the Bataan east coast and the main road there, where they were marshaled into columns and force marched north to a railhead in San Fernando. Most of the prisoners began the long walk at the tip of the Bataan and had to march the full 66 miles to the railhead, others joining along the way. One constant was the attitude of the Japanese soldiers, who considered surrender a base act and prisoners of war little more than chattel. They were spoils of war that were good for little but forced labor. The Japanese brutalized their captives during the march north to the trains that would take them to a prison camp. They beat them all the time, and sometimes just to move them along, or sometimes for sport. Many of the prisoners were battle worn and incapable of keeping up the grueling pace of the march, especially in the tropical heat and with little water. Those who dropped from exhaustion or sickness fell behind, broke ranks to fetch water, or tried to escape were bayoneted, shot, or beheaded. Men who could not rise the next morning to continue were often buried alive or beaten to death with the shovels of the ditch diggers. Other prisoners who were forced to carve out graves along the way. At the railhead at San Fernando, prisoners were jammed into small pre-war boxcars, 100 men or more, into a conveyance meant for 40. There was little air in the oven-like cars, and hundreds of men died standing up. Finally, after an additional march, the sick, starving, and brutalized captives were herded into prison camps, one for Filipino soldiers and another for Americans, across the road from each other at a former Philippine Army training ground called Camp O'Donnell. Here, from April to October 1942, thousands of men died from sickness and starvation. During that time, the American prisoners were divided into forced labor gangs and trucked throughout the Philippines to build airfields and roads. In October, the Filipino prisoners were released. No one knew the exact number of deaths that occurred during the march and subsequent interment. Along the route and the main march, perhaps many as 500 Americans and perhaps 2,500 Filipino soldiers were killed. In Camp O'Donnell, perhaps some 26,000 Filipino soldiers and some 1,500 Americans died of starvation and disease. In all, of the some 22,000 Americans captured by the Japanese forces in the Bataan Peninsula, only about 15,000 returned to the United States, a death rate more than 30%. By comparison, the Allied POWs held by the Nazis and other Axis powers during World War II suffered a death rate of about 3%. The story of the Bataan Death March has come to dominate the role that the Philippines played in World War II. The Japanese military had forced marches in other places it had conquered, and it worked to death thousands of British, Dutch, and Australian prisoners of war. But those atrocities did not make headlines until later. Even the Bataan Death March was something of a secret for several years. At first, the American government, fearing that the Japanese forces would retaliate against their captives, embargoed news and details of the march. Then, in January of 1944, in part to launch a war bond drive, but also to reflame the fighting spirit of a war-weary United States, the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt released details of the march that had been provided by a handful of captives who had escaped and made their way to Australia. It was in the manner that what quickly became known as the Bataan Death March became a legend of the evils of war. After the end of World War II, the Japanese commander of the invasion forces in the Philippines, Lieutenant General Hama Masharu, was charged with responsibility for the march and widespread abuses at Camp O'Donnell. He was tried and convicted by a U.S. military commission in Manila in January to February of 1946 and was executed by firing squad on April 3rd of 1946. In the years that followed, the men who fought in the Philippines formed a veterans organization, the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor, to press for reparations from Japan and better treatment by the American government of the veterans of these campaigns. And in the 1980s, the U.S. officially recognized the suffering and sacrifice of these veterans, awarding them the Bronze Star and eventually classifying them as 100% disabled for American pensions. The Bataan Death March is also a little more important to me because 1,800 New Mexican National Guardsmen fought in the Philippines, and of the 1,800 New Mexico men sent to the Philippines, 900 survived the battle for Bataan and the horrors and atrocities of the Death March, and the privation and deep humiliation of the 40 months spent in prisoner of war camps. And with that, this will be the end of the episode. Thank you guys very much for coming, and hopefully opening your eyes to many atrocities that you might have not heard of during World War II. If you did enjoy, please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification. Also, remember to stick around for part 2, because I will be covering 3 more atrocities that the Japanese committed. And with that, I hope you guys have a wonderful day.